Now, after Section 377 being read down, marriage is back again on talks. It's been on and off, I think. And now it is back on. I've recently heard one of the lawyer, Menaka Guruswamy, mentioning at a talk that with all the young people that she talks, one common thing is that they all look for stable relationship, and that is marriage. And I'm really curious, I think, interested to meet all these young people who really want to get married. I mean, even before they, think about education, employment, economy, social security, all other kinds of things, I think. So, and what is this marriage that we all are so ensnared by, and we are, in a sense, that is touched all our lives, no matter who we are, heterosexual, homosexual, cisgender, transgender, where we are from in the world. That's something we all are affected by in some sense, or related to it in some sense, I think. So in this panel, we would like to, or make an attempt to look at that marriage and understand what it means and what it meant and what it is doing to us as individuals and collectives, and where are we heading with it? And how much ever queer people, or however amount of queer people, want to have marriage. How well do we understand what we want, and even if that is marriage, and what it means to us? And of course, there are movies that really, even queer movies that come up these days, they talk about marriage. The happily ever ending after is certainly with a marriage, with all the recent queer movies that are coming up, and even in Bollywood, I think. So to talk about that marriage in two different lenses, we have three panelists. And the first panelist is Dr. Ponni. Ponni is currently based out of Batikal, Sri Lanka. She's a historian, originally from Tamil Nadu. She has been part of many queer collectives from the early 2000s, Niga, Anjum, Voices Against 377, and so on. They have worked at Alternative Law Forum Bangalore, and today they'll be the first panelist and take us to the feminist perspective and feminist lens of the marriage. Ponni, over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So beyond the sort of more formal bio, and of course it matters what it is that I've spent a lot of my life thinking through in terms of disciplines, I just want to lay out who I'm speaking as today. I'm speaking as someone with a very close relationship to thinking about the world through the lens of the law by virtue of being trained in it and having lived with it. I'm also speaking as a feminist, and that as my worldview of how I see the world. And we can talk more about what I mean by that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. I'm also speaking as a queer person in her 30s who has come to take the sense of safety that is our right during our life, after our death, when we fall sick, when we want to share different parts of our lives with different people, to have the sense that there is some way by which these things can be socially or legally recognized, from the sense of feeling a sense of safety as a person living through this world that we live in. So I'm also speaking from that perspective. And these are very, very initial thoughts. And give me the benefit of doubt to say that I'm presenting here for us all to think together. And I'm hoping that some of what I'm saying will be a starting point for us to think of how we may have this conversation beyond dichotomies of pro and anti-marriage. Because I think this sense of feeling secure in the socio-legal regimes that do govern our lives is an important thing to be taken under consideration. But does it have to be within the framework of marriage? So I think that's what I'd like to address. So what is marriage? So for some of you, this may be repetitive, but I think it's always good to sort of set down some of the basics always. As many of us know, it's a contract. It's a legal contract. And here I'm talking about
একটু পরে খাচ্ছি, তোরা
monogamous
খা।
marriage.
একটু একটা জিনিস একটু পরে খাচ্ছি, তোরা খা, আমার জন্য রেখে দে, আমি একটু পরে খাচ্ছি।
Um, So, children, so marriage is a contract. It's a contract that organizes many different things in our lives. It's also a more recent legal institution that has been deeply connected to older institutions like that of caste, religion, etc., and also class related to private property, essentially. It's also to do with what some people may call social reproduction, affairs to do with the home, family, reproducing of actual human beings, etc. And it's also the connection between social reproduction and production, as it were, which are connected to money, property, market, etc. Um, in terms of being a contract, it's often been an unfair one. And here I think we have a lot to learn from the origins of where contract law comes from within the history of modern law as we know it. And it goes back to slavery in a really interesting way. And any lawyers here would know this. So within the system of slavery, human beings were the object upon which the contract was signed. And upon the abolition of slavery, the biggest shift was that the human beings were no longer the object, but they became actual humans who signed onto a labor contract within the system of indentureship. But we all know that historically, even though this shift is significant and cannot be underestimated, the conditions within which workers lived, whether they were enslaved people or indentured workers, were often very, very similar. The legal regimes under which they lived were often very, very similar. So the contract that was signed by indentured laborers were often unfair. And that's another talk I'm not going to go into. And in many ways, modern marriage as we know it has placed women somewhere on the continuum between slavery and indentureship in how it is set out within the law and how it is governed by the law. So just to keep that in mind. And it's also a contract, and I think this is one of the more important things, that has overreaching power over many of our other relationships that may not be contractually obligatory. And it's also one that is so deeply contractually obligatory that it seeps into every aspect of how we may be married. Whether it is to do with love, trust, intimacy, the contractual obligation is very hard to ignore, as it were, because it is such a huge, overwhelming structure within law and society. So from this whole analysis is where we have this idea of heteronormativity. And to go through it very simply, if marriage is the basic unit by which two people can access social legal rights together, and then they then go on to form a family, quote unquote, which happens through procreation, preferably biological, but nowadays more and more that's being challenged. And these units called family form societies, and often many sets of these societies together form the nation state. So marriage as an institution is extremely significant all the way up to the unit by which the entire world is governed, which is of the nation state. So to start, marriage may be many other things, and people may have many narratives of what marriage is to them, how they live their marriage, etc. But these elements of marriage, in a socio-legal historical sense, are things that we cannot deny or ignore. So now I want to move on to what the feminist response in India has been to this idea of marriage. And I want to talk about this through a very specific instance. As you know, we have a long-standing movement against violence against women. And this goes back at least to the 70s, if not earlier, and has gathered strength over time, etc. So one form of violence against women is marital rape. So through this long history of different spaces within the women's movements in India, there have been very strong voices, especially with emphasis on changing the laws to be more just towards women and other marginalized people. And a lot of passion has been brought to these movements. And I'm proud to say I'm very much come in that line and I was a part of it. But the voices to make marital rape criminal, I know from being in many rooms where it was discussed, was not spoken of with the same passion. And this has been something that's been sticking in my head for at least a decade and a half at this point. So we know that the battle to make marital rape criminal will be a very hard one with the state, because as mentioned before, questioning the institution of marriage can cause danger all the way up to questioning the nation state itself. So that we know. But for example, when we had a conversation local and then national level on the sexual assault bill to change a series of laws to do with sexual assault, many things were discussed. Those were the conversations from which now we have a broadened definition of rape beyond penile vaginal intercourse, for example. We have a specific addressal of custodial rape. We even had long discussions on gender neutrality of the survivor as well as the perpetrator. Marital rape was mentioned in this discussion as well. But I remember from that room that it wasn't taken up with the same level of passion that everything else was at that time. And so it's possible to say that a critique of marriage within the women's movement in India still remains about rights of women within marriage. So violence against women more generally, child marriage, dowry, etc. And marital rape is hard to kind of address with that same gusto because it gets to the very core of the marriage contract. It takes away that axis of power that keeps that contract intact. So this is something for us to remember, but at the same time also remember the exceptions to it, which is the large amount of work that's being done under the umbrella of single women, whether it be women farmers, whether it be who Ranjana Padi calls those who are left behind, who are the widows of farmers who committed suicide. And of course, the vibrant sex workers movement, which has a very different approach to all of this. So there are always exceptions. And there are also people who are feminists, who are part of the women's movement, who have enacted a whole range of subversions where they retain the economic and legal regimes of civil rights that are accorded to them by virtue of marriage, but at the same time subvert it in one way or another. And I don't have enough information to be able to lay out those stories for you, but I know that they are there. But on the whole, we still don't have a strong voice for criminalizing marital rape. And I think that is a comment on how and to what extent we are able to critique the institution of marriage, even as feminists. Then there is the other vibrant history of using marriage, using the institution of marriage that Tashi began with to subvert other structures of oppression like caste, for example. So the Periyar and the self-respect movement in Tamil Nadu very clearly and loudly encouraged intercaste marriage as a way of breaking down the hegemony of caste. And it wasn't just about breaking down the hegemony of caste. It was actually way more radical than that. 3 people married. There is an example of 2 women who left a note saying, because we couldn't be without each other, we both married this one man, you know. So there's a lot of radical histories there of continuing to retain the institution of marriage, but try and take away various elements of power within it. And we know that these are struggles that continue today, and they are violently put down, whether they're intercaste or interreligious marriages. But I've often been in conversations with feminists where we have all often kind of very tiredly said that, you know, you work with young women for years on end, and then, you know, towards this liberation that we dream of, and then it's as if they imagine their liberation has this end goal, and that end goal is becoming part of a marriage that was subversive, that by running away with someone they're not supposed to marry. And then you're just kind of sitting there being like, okay, so this is what we were doing feminist work for with them all this time, that this is where they see their liberation. And this continues to be the reality for many of us who are working with young women. And we continue to ask this question of why this is so, and are very realistic about why this is so as well. So where do queers come in all of this? So we needed to be subversive about our choice of family, intimacy, love, and trust to begin with. We needed to do the work to define those things for ourselves. We aren't above the rules. Of course, we live in the same world that everyone else does, but we were much less subsumed by them, much less governed by them. And so the places where queers have been given rights to marriage, or even common law for that matter, and modern marriage as we know it in its monogamous legal version connected to private property and private children, gay people who can marry also look like other married people do, with private property, growing private children, preferably biologically created nowadays, and then most importantly, letting the contract overwhelm their spaces of intimacy, love, and trust. And more importantly, letting this contract decide the shape of their social web, economically, legally, and emotionally. So those who don't fit within this mold, they sometimes access these rights through marriage in places where queer people can, and then they subvert many of its controls while also enjoying its privileges. So this also happens constantly. So then you're like, okay, here is another feminist ranting against marriage. Like, what's new, right? And fair enough, right? So let me be clear here. I'm not underestimating the social, economic, legal, and emotional power of this contract and all the ways in which it reaffirms hierarchies of caste, class, etc. But at the same time, I am also realistic about the importance of civil rights. And Sunil will talk about this a lot more. And recognition under the law for us to feel safe in society. So I've lived in a common law partnership with my then romantic partner in Canada, and it was a very bizarre and comforting experience at the same time. So the safety and acknowledgement of one's intimate relationship was bizarre and safe at the same time. But if your life is structured with all the honesty to your heart and all the complications that emerge from that honesty, a recognition of one intimate partnership is not a recognition of me as a social unit. So, for example, I may want to file taxes with one person. I may want to give rights over my physical health to another person. I may will whatever earrings and books I have to another person. But then I also know that the law, in its very logic, requires consistency. That's also something that it requires. So legal documents are often used as evidence for each other to prove that the other one is right. And we all know this. We've all been to a government office, filled papers and forms. But it's also they're used as evidence to show that I exist, right, often in society. And more so, like hashtag Aadhaar card, right? So if these documents are inconsistent, because you know your structures of love and trust and intimacy are inconsistent and complex, so it should technically jeopardize and practically jeopardize the efficacy of law in being able to give you the safety of civil rights. But then again, does it really do that? So, and I think this is where I want to start off conversations where we imagine other models. So I want to ask, can we think about according civil rights to social units in terms of time or duration, where you have to reconfirm every few years that you want to share those civil rights with that person? And this is not so unheard of. In Sri Lanka, you get a spouse visa, but it can't be for more than 3 years. So every 3 years, you have to go and reconfirm that you're still the spouse of this person to continue to live in this country. And I know people who've been doing that for 30 years. So funny as it may be, I'm also like, that's kind of cool, actually. Then it's bureaucracy, but then that's what working with the law means, right? You can't help it. Then can we also think about civil rights in terms of place? So if we are living in multiple jurisdictions, are we able to divide our civil rights across those different jurisdictions differently? Could I have a certain set of rights with a particular person in Canada as opposed to in India, as opposed to in Sri Lanka, as opposed to in Kashmir, which should be a different jurisdiction, and it's not. So can we divide civil rights in terms of realms of life? Can we talk about it in terms of finances, property, taxes within a particular realm? Can we talk about medical needs and health as another realm? Can we talk about progeny or children, whether it's biological or adopted, as another realm? Can we talk about hello? Am I still here?
We can hear you.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So can we talk about what happens after my death as a different realm of civil rights within the law? Can we divide it into realms and leave room for some level of consistency, but also some level of diversity? So I think fundamentally what I'm asking is, and I'm asking all of us to consider this, is that whether we can get the law to fit better or be malleable enough to hold our lives, rather than asking that we all fit within the existing socio-legal normativity of marriage in its form as we know it. So in this imagined relatively open legal regime, protection from violence, which I still think should be a socio-legal responsibility, I think it should be equally available to all, and also hopefully in this, it should be redundant in this faraway future where we're all living in Mars and we've broken down heteronormativity, and so there's no intimate violence anymore. So I'm just dreaming. But basically, you shouldn't need legal protection because people have stopped doing it. That's not going to happen. But a girl can dream. So other thing I want to suggest is that these things I'm urging us to begin to imagine, I don't think is just for queers. I think it's also to release straight folks from Tashi will call endless karma or whatever cycle of marriage and monogamy and property and progeny and adultery and divorce and custody, and it's not working. It hasn't been working for a really long time. So these new imaginations is liberation for everyone. We will be able to liberate straight folks from this endless vicious cycle. But I think most importantly for me, I think the sort of flexibility and openness in the letter of the law, as feminist lawyers have argued and said for a long time, it gives us more space in how these laws play out in court. So for long, feminist lawyers have argued that while there should be attempts always at opening up the law to different forms of human life, the goal should not be to have strict definitions of anything, even of the so-called alternatives, and that we should embrace the fuzziness of law because it leaves us in a better standing to stand up for the marginalized in the everyday labor of legal representation in courts, whether it's in from lower courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. So to end with one last point, so queers, and here I'm speaking to our community of queer people, um, even if you don't believe, right? Even if you don't believe that your queerness is or must be one that's about inclusivity and a challenge to all social hierarchy and so on, I do. But even if you don't believe that, I think in the least, your queerness must have given you, like it has given me, a freedom that many who are on set heteronormative paths don't have, which is of choosing every day with every breath how you love, how you trust, and to choose your intimacy to be one that's honest and safe and fulfilling. And whatever that choice may look like, we can make those choices through a process that touches sort of a deep liberation to any extent that we can. And this is different for different people. I don't think there's a fixed definition of what that liberation looks like. So I know this process is really hard. I mean, I am lesbian and we process, but I think this is also our gift. And it's also what makes us free on the inside, even when we are constantly suffocated by unfreedom all around us. So let's not for some boring contract is, I think, what I'm trying to say at the end of the day. So the law can be a container, like some kadai or whatever in which we are cooking, but then let it not be the kind of container that corrupts the taste of freshly ground masala powder, right? Made in with the precise proportions and process of spices that we have chosen based on the desires and the tongues of ourselves and all our loved ones. I had to end with tongues because, So yeah, that's all I've got.
Thanks, Ponni. I think that last food part was for the love of food love I have for the food, I think. So thank you. And I think, in all my online, everything went online now, I think, and including our Buddhist philosophy classes. And I'm hearing the word liberation in a very different context after a long time in the lockdown, I think. Thanks for that. I'm not going to talk about karma, not yet. Probably sometime later. I should say one thing. I think me being queer actually did give me the more freedom, or the more easy freedom to be a monastic, I think. If I was not queer, if I'm cisgender, heterosexual, God, I can't imagine what it was like or what it is like. They wouldn't have given me enough freedom to be a monastic the way I am today, I think. So thanks for reminding about that freedom, I think, and also reminding us about the boring legal aspects, but nonetheless the things that we all live in, mostly cis hetero people, telling that queer people that it's not just your freedom is not just about your freedom, but also you have the power and capacity to engage with things in a sense to liberate the larger population, even cis hetero people, I think is something to give a thought for. I'll quickly move on to introducing Mario, and we can come back for questions to all the panelists at the end, I think, instead of doing for what do you think, Ponni? You want to take questions now? You want to take questions at the end, towards the end?
Maybe towards the end, maybe Mario.
Towards the end. Okay.
Yeah, altogether the end sounds good.
Okay, good. So yeah, Mario is a historian. He's writing his PhD on Hijras in the 18th century, Western India at Rutgers University, New Jersey. His interest lies in history of the Deccan politics, caste, gender, and sexuality. He has worked in queer organizing, notably with Anjum at JNU, Delhi's first queer students collective. He's also a fellow of the Professionals Congress. Other than that, Mario will hold a grudge on me for disturbing his sleep time and keeping this meeting at 4 o'clock. But that should be directed to Ponni, not towards me, Mario. I'm telling you beforehand. Over to you.
Did you ask me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I'm not sure if my internet connection is the greatest. So if it isn't, I will ask you to bear with me. And I can't really see the audience either. So I really hope this goes well. If it doesn't, I apologize in advance. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mario de Penha, and I'm a historian, as Tashi said. I work on hijras in the 18th century Western India. I want to thank Anveshi, the Firefly community, and the Queer Women's Collective India for hosting this conversation. I also want to thank Ponni for proposing the panel, Sunil for agreeing to be on it, and sharing his experiences with us, and Tashi for bringing it all together. Many lifetimes ago, Ponni, Sunil, and I were part of a queer arts and media collective in Delhi called Niga, which organized an annual festival called the Queer Fest, among other events. So it's really wonderful to get together and have this conversation with old friends and new ones today after many, many years. Um, can you see me now? Okay. So I suppose there is a lot that one can say about the politics of marriage, but I thought I would approach the whole issue of marriage within queer communities through two broad, separate, but sometimes intersecting frameworks. One is marriage as it is experienced within queer life worlds, and two, queer marriage in the law. Ponni's already covered a great deal of the law, so I won't. But I'll try to cover the life worlds part a little more. Um, I use the term queer marriage instead of same sex marriage in this presentation because I explicitly want to bring hijra and transgender experiences of marriage into the discussion instead of a singular focus on same sex couples. Now, earlier this year, before the madness of this pandemic, the subsequent lockdowns, the collapse of life as we know it occurred, I attended the wedding of my friends Daniel and Tyron in Goa. I'm going to show you some Shadi ka pictures. All right. Now, the wedding was a beautiful affair, and my friends had agreed to a film crew coming in. The film crew was from Netflix, and they were shooting it for an upcoming TV show on Indian weddings. And just before you freak out, no, it wasn't Indian matchmaking, thank God. Now, Daniel and Tyron had already had a civil and church ceremony in Germany, and they chose to get hitched with Hindu rituals in Goa. Hi, I'm back. So while the wedding reception was on, the film crew reached out to a few guests and asked them if they would mind being interviewed for the show, and they wanted to know what the guests thought about queer coupling, about marriage, about weddings. And one of the other guests, suggested that I give the crew a bite, which led the film crew to look very horrified and crestfallen. And that was because they said, "Sorry, sir, we're only looking for straight, gay, and lesbian couples to share their views, and I'm single." So thankfully, at that moment, I thought it was very amusing, and I just laughed at my accursed singlehood. But I was amused at the assumption that only somebody in a relationship would have something worthwhile to say about love. Now, this is another reason I'm very thankful for this panel because it's my way of skirting the barriers laid out by the Netflix film crew and putting my views out on queer marriage anyway. Now, sadly, this film crew's veneration of the idea of marriage and the hierarchical importance they gave to couples and coupling, even queer coupling, is not altogether rare to find in Indian society, and perhaps even in the world. In many contexts, weddings are expected life cycle ritual, and marriages are placed on a pedestal over other ways of living and interacting with the world. In reality, however, the nuclear family that follows from marriage is not the only form of household that exists out there in the world. Even in India, the census has recorded a slow yet steady decline in the number of nuclear families as a percentage of households over time. In the United States, this shift has been much starker, and the number of non family households has increased from 15% of the population in 1960 to 35% in 2020. So now more than ever before, both in the US and in India, we are the first generation of queer people to experience decriminalization. And as this generation, it is vital to consider models for other kinds of queer living that lie outside the framework of marriage. Now, in this presentation, I want to ask what happens? What happens when this worldview that prizes marriage over all other forms of kinship is decentered and subverted. What happens when coupling, romantic intermingling, maybe even marriages between two people give way to other forms of communitarian interaction and kinship? Within queer context, what happens when collective forms of queer friendships and kinship take precedence over the idea of two people forming an exclusive union between themselves? What I am proposing here requires a bit of a leap of imagination, because for most of us, our socialization has occurred within contexts where marriage is seen as inevitable. But what I am proposing here also doesn't require a leap of imagination, because the evidence for these forms of collective queer kinship have appeared before us through history, and they are also around us in contemporary times. This framework for a different model of queer kinship has come to us from the Hijra community, which I study, in the form of the household or the gharana system. And it is a model of interaction, and I make this claim consciously as a historian, that has endured for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, in this presentation, I want to ask, what would it look like if the primary model for queer interaction, kinship, in our imagination wasn't this idea of looking for a romantic partner, living together as a couple, perhaps getting married, but instead, the primary model was building friendships, communitarian living in the way that this works in the Hijra community. I don't present these two options in opposition to each other. Okay. I merely want to ask, what happens when we decenter marriage or even coupling as our imagined primary forms of living with and interacting, living within and interacting with the world? Okay. So, for those of us who may be unfamiliar with the Hijra community, the gharana or the household is the primary unit through which Hijras have made sense of their lives for hundreds of years. Now, Hijra gharanas or households can be quite complex. In this picture, which is from Bengal in the 19th century, you can see a Hijra guru in the center, a chela to her left, and an attendant to her right. I don't know what the term for this attendant would have been in Bengal, but in Maharashtra at that time, the term would have been a munda. This is a very faint image, but here again, you can see a troop of hijras from North India in the 19th century. And even here, you can see that, that there are groups, and there is obviously a kinship network between themselves that does not conform to the ideal of marriage. Oops, sorry. Okay. So in my own research on Hijra communities in the 18th century in Maharashtra, I have proposed that this I propose that this difference in imagined and lived life worlds for Hijras is because Hijras consider themselves to be essentially monks, sort of like Tashi over here. Monks like sadhus and fakirs that we know of in India. And these are people who attempt to move outside the framework of family, marriage, and caste. Now, in the Indian or the Hindu worldview, there is the idea of duty towards, one's family, and that is and caste group, and all of these duties are known through the word samsar. At least in Maharashtra and North India, this word samsar exists. I'm not sure how it exists in other parts of the country, but there is an idea that you have to perform your duty, and that duty is samsar. Now, people who choose to move away from this focus on sansar become sannyasis, or they take sannyas, which is another form of life that hijras, fakirs, sadhus, etc., all follow. Uh, and the idea is that you are on a journey through life. You are uprooting yourself from caste, you're uprooting yourself from family, you are extinguishing the ego, you're extinguishing yourself, and moving through life, uh, seeking either moksha or some kind of fulfillment, and that fulfillment can differ according to which religious background you come from. Now, if this form of life that hijras, sadhus, and fakirs live is so different uh, from the sansar of families, of caste groups, etc. It's some of the light around this has been shown on by Ambedkar, who basically said to us that caste only sustains itself because of endogamy, meaning that caste sustains itself because people marry each other within the same caste, and that is how caste sustains itself. Now, if somebody moves away from that framework, moves away from the framework of family, moves away from the framework of caste to form a separate community of people who come from a variety of other communities, now that is a challenge to endogamy in itself. And I think that's very important when it comes to the Hijra community. Now, if you look at this whole group of let's broadly call them sannyasis, and I count Hijras within this group, you diminish your previous self, or you diminish your previous identity, usually by doing different things to the body. So Hijras will wear women's clothes, bangles, and extinguish their previous identity. Then you have
Hi,
certain.
Mario. Sorry to interrupt you. We are not able to see the photos that or screen. There's some problem. None of
No,
us.
right now it's just there's no photo.
No, earlier photo also we could not see.
Okay. Were you able to see, and was this
The,
problem with everybody else,
yeah,
or?
yeah. Everybody else also. Nobody could see it.
Okay, let me go through the photos
Yeah,
one more
yeah,
time, and you can
yeah,
tell me if you can see them. Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Can you see the photos now? Hello.
Not yet.
No, Mar.
You
Not
can't
yet.
see it.
We
Mar,
just saw your title slideshow, and then after that we couldn't see the photos.
You can see this.
no.
Hello.
Mario, why don't you maybe finish the talk so it doesn't get too interrupted, and we'll try again.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure why the slides weren't working. Sorry about that. I'll try
Mario,
to
the
see.
first one was. The first one was. But after that, the pictures were not visible.
Okay, I don't know why that is. Um, I'll try to do it at the end of the presentation. Um, okay, for now it's just my beautiful face, so deal with that. Um, so, okay, so essentially, group of people who do different things to their body in order to, leave behind their previous identities. You do hear about Nath sadhus who have pierced earlobes and big earrings that go through their ear. Now that gives them a specific identity, but it also means that they've left behind all their previous uh, family and caste-based identities. You hear about this through Sufis who, are supposed to cover themselves with coarse wool, and that again through something that you do to your body, moderation, any kind of moderation to the body, modification to the body. You move away from the ascribed identities of family and caste, and you choose something else to for yourself. So it is it is it is this way of life that's not sansar, and that's not the extreme where that's also known as samadhi, where you end your life because you want to achieve some kind of spiritual liberation. It's this middle life that then becomes a form of living in the world, but also not in the, not in the world, and also not dying. And that is what thirdness actually is. Now, there are many communities in colonial and pre-colonial India who live these kinds of lives. Hijras are just one of them. There are also the Jogappas, who you hear about a lot in southern Maharashtra and northern Karnataka. And if you think about the word Hijra itself, Hijra is a word which in Arabic means to leave your own tribe or your community behind. And so it really brings together this notion that there is something that is assigned to you at birth, but you can leave that behind. And the way of doing that is through leaving your old identity back and joining another community. So these are the forms of life that I really think we as queer people need to think about. These are the life worlds that exist all around us. They have existed for a long time. Yes, in terms of hierarchies, there is a lot of problems, but even families have their own hierarchies, and marriages have their own hierarchies. I don't think it's easy to find social structures that are completely unproblematic, but I think this is a kind of life world that we should really spend some time thinking about as a model for for how to interact with each other as queer people, for a model of queer kinship that really has, for the most part, been out of off the radar. Um, then, of course, uh, the other thing I want to say is that just because the primary identity for Hijras comes from this notion of collective kinship, you put it's called putting a wreath in a certain household, in a certain gharana, and then you become part of that gharana. Just because that form of kinship exists and is the primary form of kinship for hijras, it doesn't mean that they don't have marriages or coupling or relationships on the side. But those marriages are never the primary. Now, I have a friend called Mayur Suresh, who some of you may know, and Mayur's done some really exciting work on hijras and property, and the way that property disputes between hijras have worked in Indian courts. And what he seems to have found that while there is often, a husband on the side or a relationship on the side, um, that is never the primary identity, and the courts also recognize that, especially in terms of property, that property moves from within the Hijra household and not outside. So, but of course, historically, there has been work from historians like John Boswell, who wrote a book on same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe, and Ruth Vanita, who's done similar work for India, and both of them show that some kinds of coupling, some kinds of marriages, there is a history to them in specific contexts, um, in the past. So uh, again, like I asked this question around queer life worlds, uh, what are the other forms of queer kinship that this whole question of marriage glosses over? With the law, I want to ask similar questions. Like, what are the other struggles around the law for queer people? Um, what are the other struggles around the law for queer people that this question of marriage also glosses over? So it's similar for both life worlds and the law. One thing I would like us to all think about is, in terms of the experience of the US, decriminalization happened in the late 90s, and then it took about 15 years of constant activism, uh, 17 years of activism for marriage rights, marriage equality to come through. And after decriminalization, the first priority for the community sort of became marriage equality, even though there was no comprehensive anti-discrimination law on the board. And that comprehensive anti-discrimination law only came, this year, so 5 years after marriage equality. So in 1998, you had decriminalization. Then in 2015, you had marriage equality across the US, and in 2020, um, you had anti-discrimination. But this led to a situation where you could, for instance, be married in 2015, and if your employer found out you were married to somebody of the same sex, then you could be dismissed from your job, and there would be no recourse because that was still legal. So these are the things we really have to think about in terms of what the priority is in India. But at the same time, I do get that marriage uh, has been can be pretty radical when the lines of endogamy are crossed. There was a very famous case. I have a slide, but maybe I can show it to you later. In the U.S. of Mildred and Richard Loving, who were this interracial couple, a white man and a black woman, who had gotten married in 1958 in Washington, D.C. But when they lived um, in Virginia, which is just across the border, there was a law that had said that they couldn't share a bed, and then they were put in jail. They were given a prison sentence, and the case that they fought became uh, a very famous case, Loving versus Virginia, in which they were in which uh, it was declared that these anti-miscegenation or racial crossing marriage laws were against the law. And then, of course, even in India, you've had situations where queer people have tried to get married to each other, have gotten married to each other, not legally, but ceremonially, ritually, and had to face a flag for that. Now, this famously happened in 1987 in a case uh, of two women called Leela and Urmila. and they were both in the police in Madhya Pradesh, and they were sacked from their jobs because the truth of their relationship sort of came out. So of course, there are many reasons that people get married. There is the property reason, and I think a lot of us tend to look down on people who want to secure marriage, sort of property security through marriage. And I don't, I'm not the kind of person who does that myself, because I know for a lot of people, security through property can actually mean, a significant difference, especially for women. In Indian courts, you will often find, women who live in the most humblest of circumstances, but they will say that they cannot be cast out of their marital home and they have a right to live there. And it may not be much. They may be in a resettlement colony in a small juggi somewhere, but there are so many cases where that right of property. So it's not like they're not fighting for mahals all the time, and they're not fighting for large estates. But usually, it's these small cases in which property rights are endorsed. So I think that's something some of us should think more about. But beyond property, also, a lot of people want marriage rights just for basic dignity. And I think Ponni covered some of these bases. I'm sure Sunil will cover more in his presentation. So uh, I don't want to take more time on this. The other thing I want to think about is, um, in terms of the Hijra community. Like, there's a lot that remains um, undone. There's a lot that the Nalsa verdict hasn't been fully implemented in law and spirit. There's an awful transgender act that got passed last year. There are several problems with it. Maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer round if somebody's interested, or you may also know about this. So in these situations where you have a right-wing government in place that really isn't, you know, doesn't really care about queer rights, but wants to perform lip service to, the Hijra community because they've been ordered to by the Supreme Court. I think it's approaching either the courts or the government for marriage rights is again something we really need to think about um, a lot. So I'll sort of wrap my presentation here, because I think I've gone over time quite a lot. I'm going to try do the slide share one last time, and maybe you can tell me if you can see that. All right. Can you guys see this?
Yeah, we can see the
Yeah.
smile.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me try one more thing. Hold on. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. So those are my friends who got married in Goa. Um, for the picture on the left, it's Tyron and then Daniel on the right. Um, Sorry, one sec. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's more from their wedding. This is the hijra can you see this one?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the hijra from Bengal in the middle. It's a picture from the 19th century. On her left, uh, the smaller figure is probably a chela, And on her right, the attendant in Maharashtra would be called a munda, and this person was responsible for playing the music, but also receiving the alms that were given to the hijra. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so this is, sorry, it's a faint image, but that's how it is. It's a hijra troop from North India again in the 19th century. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so this is from the research of John Boswell, who who tried to establish that there were marriages between same-sex couples in medieval Europe, and here we see a same-sex, well, two two people who are known as brothers in Greek, and there you can see that their union is being solemnized by Jesus, whose image is right above them. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Richard and Mildred Loving, the couple I spoke about, whose case was the landmark case in the U.S. that established that you were able to have interracial marriages across the U.S., and that was in the late 50s. And can you see this?
Yes.
All right, and this is Leela and Urmila, who were the two women who were sacked from the police force for getting married to each other in 1987 in Madhya Pradesh. All right. Okay, that's all from me. I don't want to go over, so probably have already, but maybe the rest in. Okay.
Hey, thanks, Mario, for that. I mean, for me, I think personally to say, to looking at kinship, the way you reminded us of or asked us to rethink about through Israelites and sadhus and fakirs and other people. I mean, it is making me rethink about the frameworks within the Buddhist monastic community where the ordaining master is asked to be looked up like as a father, and the ordaining master is supposed to take care of the people or the monks and nuns who they ordain as their children. I think, yeah, I mean, that was in a sense kind of not so imaginable I mean, even when I lived in Bodh Gaya for that matter, but now to look at from the view you presented, it's interesting, I think. Thank you for that. I'll quickly introduce Sunil, and we'll take the questions with you also at the ending. Mario? So, okay. Thank you, Sunil, for accepting on such a short notice and agreeing to be part of the panel. Sunil has a PhD from University of Westminster, and they are have been involved with independent photography as a critical practice for many years, focusing on race, migration, and queer issues. In 1980s, Sunil constructed documentary images of gay men in architectural spaces in Delhi, his Exile series. The images and text describe the conditions for gay men in India at times. Sunil's recent series, Mr. Malhotra's Party, updates this theme during a time in which queer identities are more open and also reside in a virtual space on internet and in private parties. His documentary series, Christopher Street, was shot in mid-1970s and later studied under a Lesed model at the New School for Social Research and became interested in the idea of gay public space. Sunil is also a professional fellow at UCA Farnham, visiting lecturer at Kingston University, and visiting tutor at Royal College of Art, London. I mean, their work is extensive. If I start talking about Sunil's work, I think that should be a separate session. They have their website. Please go and check. It's really interesting to look at that kind of work over the course of last 2-3 decades. I think it's rich and it's also intriguing in many ways. Sunil, over to you. Thank you again for accepting and joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here amongst old friends and hopefully some new ones. So I realize that we've had a long session so far. I'm not going to extend it too much. I have a few pictures, so I'm going to just talk to them. I'm primarily a picture kind of person. It's a miracle I got a PhD. Anyway, luckily it had involved very few words. And so before I launch into the slide, I'll just show you a picture like this. I don't know if it's very visible. It's a picture of the postcard at the back. It tells us that Violet Jones and Joan Lee met in a telephone exchange in London and fooled a vicar into marrying them in 1954. So actually, LGBT marriage was possible if you managed to fool the authorities, which certainly several people managed to do. They can't be the only ones. So on to the pictures, and I'm going to time myself, so we're not going to be here for all day. Right. I'm going to start here, 72. It's where I began to really come out and be very politically gay as well, an undergraduate in Montreal. And for me, something that we haven't talked about much, at the time, the main issue was mental health, because homosexuality was defined as a mental illness. So that was actually the first hurdle to get over. And this guy was one of the people who was really changing that approach and became very prominent for a while. And he very
Sunil,
psychologically,
sorry
yeah.
Are you sharing
yeah,
anything right now? Because we can't see anything.
Oh yeah, I'm not sharing the screen. Oops, here we go. Now? Any good? Can you see anything?
Not yet, but maybe it takes a second or two to load. But right now we can't see anything.
Okay, that'll be, maybe I can choose a window. Oh no, I've lost everything. Okay.
Yeah, once you click share, you should be able to select a window, and that itself will be shared.
Yeah, oh yeah, the window hasn't come up. Oh dear, so where's the window? No.
We can see your file explorer right now. We can see your folders.
Sorry about this, guy. I should have done this earlier.
That's okay.
Do you see that? No.
I think you have to deselect your file explorer window and select the image itself. Otherwise, you'll only be able to see your folder view.
Yeah. Ramika will add some Bihar proof and whoever she knows. So,
Yes, we can see it now. But we seem to have lost your audio. Okay. Sunil, are you there? If you're speaking, we can't hear you. We can see the images though.
Muted.
Sunil, unmute yourself.
How about that?
Yeah. Yes.
Now you can hear me, but not see the pictures.
Are your pictures up? Yeah, we can see them now. Everything seems to.
Can you hear me as well?
Yes.
You can hear me and see the pictures.
Yep. Audio.
Okay, so oh great. So we swiftly move on. So coupled with that, a bunch of seminal books came out. Dennis Altman's that defined what gay liberation was at the time, and this one by Weinberg, which was a heavy-duty kind of psycho-social book about how to define a healthy homosexual. And actually, these were the texts that were being read, and when I came out, I offered these to my parents along with some other titles as a way of educating them. Meanwhile, I met somebody when I was an undergraduate, when I was 20. There he is. He was Swiss, and we were living in Canada, but he left, so I followed him. First to New York, and then on to London. But so in New York, I encountered this post kind of gay liberation, very open public space where it seemed like there was an endless parade of gay men, visible, very visible, something I'd never seen before, who were kind of out and proud. So it seemed like in a fairly short period of time, something quite dramatic had changed in terms of public invisibility. Meanwhile, I lived on with this person in New York, but I couldn't enroll in a college to be there. So we were living together as partners. It was in that period also that I met Salim Kidwai, who would come from India to study history. And then he moved to London and I followed him here. So I'm just going to go through all this chronologically. So in London, it was kind of quite different, although it had been legal in England since the late 60s. There hadn't been any rights as such. I think the other speakers touched upon the big gap between decriminalizing something and actually having rights. So I used my camera to study this organization, London Gay Switchboard. It was the largest and still is the LGBT NGO here. It was a way for me to meet the people and find out quite a lot. And in the next picture is Emily Anderson, who was in my class at the Royal College, and we were a small class of only 7 people. So to have 2 queer people in one class was very unusual, and we were both out, and we became kind of an unofficial couple in a way. Anyway, Salim chose to go back and live in India. I chose not to go live in India because I found the situation for gay men to be incredibly oppressive. But I managed to visit him periodically. Here we are in Delhi in about 1980 or 82 or so. So I think these are kinships that start very early and live on to this day. So I found this group, the gay black group, in the 80s in London. And you can see what we meant by black. There's a little list there: African, Asian, Caribbean, Chinese, Southeast Asian, and lesbians and gay people. So, and then underneath, black people only. And we socialized like this. There'd be parties for Asian and black gays and their friends and lovers. So meanwhile, I would continue to live with this partner, but we had no social status, of course. So there was so this was something that was very common for many of us, especially as migrants who were here because of a relationship, that we had no status. So I lived in the UK with no status at all. And my entire livelihood and housing and support thing all depended on one person, and it was completely unofficial. He could have asked me to leave any day, and I would have had no recourse. Meanwhile, in the 80s in the West, this came out. We had this research, big AIDS threat. The AIDS virus came to the West as a gay plague, a bit unlike India, though. And so it kind of raised this whole issue again about what is it to be gay and the kind of re-demonizing of the whole being gay question. So our tabloids here began to react like this. They were really anti. And so this is how we responded. So on the left, there's a little flyer by a group called Homocult, who used to spread these around town. And on the right is a magazine that I took pictures for. So basically, I and many of my peers had been born out of gay liberation. It became what we did. And there was one big struggle was to fight just for the ability to be gay and exist in some space. And the second thing was, of course, that it was very anti the family because of the books that we started with. So the family was seen, and I'll repeat what's been said earlier, as a repository of both capitalism and property and all the rest of it. So we were liberating everybody by not marrying, by being as promiscuous as possible, and by finding other kinds of kinship. And it wasn't just the men, the women were also doing their thing. So major book of photographs came out, and they were to the lesbian magazine in London finally began to recognize race, because race was the other cusp that I've been working on living over here, trying to find a voice for Black and Asian voices, people. I thought I'd show you this. This is somewhere in the early 90s on Gay Pride in London. This Indian couple dressed up as a fake bride and groom, which I thought was pretty funny and ironic in their circumstances. So they were presenting as a fake hetero couple at Gay Pride. Meanwhile, in the early 2000s, I went to my first gay marriage of a former assistant of mine. This was in Massachusetts. This is one of the earliest legal gay weddings that took place. So meanwhile, queer theory had arrived in academia and then spilled over into race. And I mentioned that because for me, a lot of this social activity and activism, all that underpinned to a certain extent by work going on in academia and how it spills out into the streets. And I was then living in Delhi. There's a gay couple that I met. They'd met on the internet, and I, on the other hand, was just living on my own. So it was interesting to make a picture with kind of as a kind of reference to having a kind of marriage in the back of my mind, but maybe more some kind of intimate relationship, which I was, I guess, kind of struggling with at the time. Oh, here we all are. That's some of our group. That's Niga. So I spent my years in Delhi were made possible really because of these people and this group, which was a space to think and talk about things, and also another kind of kinship network. And then right at the end of the 2000s, I met somebody, and one day on the spur of the moment, I asked him if he'd marry me, and he agreed. I have to say our group responded very negatively. But you know, our situation was really difficult, meaning that we couldn't do anything together. So his entire time, the whole thing took place in my flat, where he was treated as a very temporary visitor. And that was completely untenable over a long period of time. I could definitely see that. We also don't share a passport common, so there was all that immigration stuff. I'd been through a lot of hassle trying to survive in the West. Unofficially, I didn't want this to happen to him. So we made up our minds to get properly legally married somewhere, but it wasn't possible in India. It wasn't possible in the UK. And so we went to Canada. This is taking place in Toronto City Hall. And this document then allowed us to now move around the world as a couple. And it's made many things much simpler and easier to manage. And that's around the time that some of the gay marriage stuff began to spread around the states. Because in the US, things seem to happen state by state. And on the left, you can see even the Queen got involved here in this country, in the UK. And there they are. Actually, I have two spouses. Deepti, of course, predates Charan by several years. But luckily, all of us get on extremely well. And I think I'm going to leave you with that thought that it's possible to have one legal marriage and one not legal marriage and still get on, and everybody can get on. It's just a matter of personal determination to fight for your right to be able to do what you want to do. So where am I? Oh yeah, I'm way over time, so I think I've already said too much. So that's been kind of my journey. It's been about fighting for the right to define yourself psychologically, then socially, and then finally to be able to live a life in a more convenient way and not always be illegal and in the margins. And I'm now 67 and I don't regret any of it. So over to you guys.
Thank you, Sunil. I mean, that's like almost time travel, I think, through your pictures. Yeah, I mean, should we open it for questions now?
Yes, otherwise we'll be here all afternoon.
Evening for
I
us.
just want to briefly describe how the question and answer process. I'm really, really sorry about the chat not being enabled for everyone. There was a glitch in the way that we started the meeting, and we're unable to change that midway through the meeting. So for now, if you should all see a small hand icon called raise your hand. So I suppose if you click that option, we'll be able to make a note of your name. And if while someone is asking a question, you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you next. But for now, the option can be please just unmute yourself and start asking a question.
Sunil, you should unshare your screen, or else Mario, Ponni, and me will be on the screen.
Perfect.
Apurva, I saw you raise your hand. Do you have a question? You can just start asking.
Oh, I was just like trying something and I think I clicked it. But thanks a lot for everybody. It was a wonderful panel.
Vikram, please go ahead.
Yes.
Hi, I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, great. Kind of like just kind of three provocation for each of the panelists if they have the time, and I mean people can choose also not to answer it. To Ponni, also yeah, of course, great panel, etc., etc. To Ponni, I was thinking if we are actually thinking about contract law and everything, and kind of relation to transatlantic slavery and indentured labor, I was thinking, why would we stop at marriage and not kind of think about the institution of gender itself as one kind of premised on contract law, right? We know that the transatlantic slavery contract creates the commodity of the black person who becomes undifferentiated in terms of gender, and is a thing, a commodity that is exchanged, is made, put in ledgers, and is made a mathematics out of. And then gender is then created as a kind of in whiteness. And then thereafter, that is why, say, black families continue to be policed and continue to suffer the afterlife of slavery, to use Saidiya Hartman. And so therefore, our incomplete families, our bad marriages, are abused by the social security system, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I was actually interested if one could think about heterosexuality itself as one that is created by the very contract and slave law that you mentioned. I also mentioned this continuation of heterosexuality because apart from the rape law kind of conversation that we had with in the amendment in 2013, we also saw the criminalization of sexual harassment, and what we've seen thereafter has been its kind of heterosexualization, where now what it does is that it polices polices stranger intimacy and so on and so forth, and continues to create gender as a space of justice rather than as a violent institution of whiteness. So I was wondering if you wanted to say something about that. To Mar, I was wondering if you wanted to say something about what is hinting at Ambedkar, what you said about the leaving of endogamy, but what people like Grace Bano and Vajanti are pointing towards is precisely the continuation of caste within the Gharana. The fact that sex work and begging often falls on Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi bodies. So I was wondering what one can think about and say about the fact that something like even sannyas sometimes takes on a very particular caste formation.
Absolutely.
And last to Sunil, I was wondering, because of your last sentence about the relation between you and Charan and so on and so forth and travel. I was wondering if you wanted to think about the continuum of the passport and marriage certificate, and if you wanted to say something about the circulation of those documents together. That's all. Thank you.
Pons, do you want to go first?
Ponni kind of got thrown out of the thing. I don't know why. So, you want to go? Meanwhile, I'll try and fix that.
Sure, absolutely. Vikram, absolutely. You know, I think it, the life of caste within Hijra communities is like a thing in itself. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to bring up too much of this. But I totally agree with you, and I agree with Grace and others, Vajanti, who are bringing up these matters today. What I would say is that in my research on the 18th century itself, there is no sense, or at least in pre-colonial times, there is no sense of what the previous identities of these hijras who were joining the gharanas were, because they're, at least from the state's perspective, they seem to accept the ideology of the community that this was a leaving behind of one's previous identity. So from the state's perspective, and the state is the body that keeps the documents, that produces the histories, very often there seems to be no concern about what the previous identities of hijras were in terms of religion or caste. The first times that we the first time that we begin to see this kind of uh, con, you know, curiosity, about the original identity or the original caste is when the British come in and they start, British officials, they start poking the Hijra community to find out what exactly were the original communities or the original caste they come from. Now, and you can see in the documents from British times, there's this tension about not wanting to answer, but through force and through coercion, eventually the Hijras do answer. And what you do see in one or two documents is that Hijras do come in from a range of communities. Uh, except Brahmin and Dalit. So on the two edges of the Varna hierarchy, you except for those two Varnas, you see a range of communities from the middle where Hijras come from. Now, I don't want to make leaps here. This is one document. That's from Maharashtra that I had the ability to look at. There's another document from Rajasthan that shows that again Hijras there coming from a variety of communities, but again there's no evidence of Dalit Hijras or Brahmin Hijras at that time. And so at least for the pre-colonial and the colonial periods, this seems to be the case. So obviously there, even when the ideology of the community is saying you should leave your previous identities behind, the fact the memory of that remains says something. And we know today, for instance, even within the Hijra communities, there's a great deal of hierarchy within. Very often within the Gharana, or Hijras who come from a previous Dalit identity will not be allowed to, go for arms receiving, and they will not be able to put their hands forward. There are things that they are allowed to do that they aren't allowed to do that other Hijras can. And of course, in the case of probably the most famous Hijra in India, you've seen how Brahmin identity has become sort of weaponized in a way to to sort of leave even the Hijra identity behind and make it like a non-Hijra Kinnar identity, and how an entire framework of thirdness within Hindutva has been created, by uh, by weaponizing that caste identity. So, of course, you're absolutely right, and as are Grace and Vajanti, who've been making these points, that caste works in multifarious ways within the Gharana system.
Sunil, you want to go next? As you make remark. You need to unmute yourself, Sunil. We cannot hear you. Is it because you changed headphones?
Sunil, do you want to see your device settings? Because Sunil is not muted. I think it might be just your device settings. Just choose your new earphones as your mic.
Sunil, I think we can hear you. Speak. No.
No.
Sunil, could you just select show device settings, those three dots that you see? On the menu, if you go and select show device settings. Tashi, if you have Sunil's number, maybe can you call Sunil and guide them? Tashi, are you able to do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Calling.
Okay, just mute yourself then, and we'll just go on to another question in the meantime. Apurva, you raised your hand, this time for real, I think. So, do you have a question? You can ask now.
I had a question for Sunil actually. But anyway, I'll just ask. So, while I was listening to Sunil also, what I wanted to ask is there's a lot of policing that happens when it comes to queer marriages. And I mean, I understand that there are a lot of different legal aspects to it, but for people who like a lot of people would say that it is more towards going towards heteronormative life, but shouldn't we also evolve with along with us the whole concept of marriage? So, just wanted to know the views of the panel on this.
Is Ponni back?
Ponni is also facing internet issues, so I don't know
Okay.
if, yeah,
She's not back.
not
All right.
yet.
Okay.
Do you want to take that question, Mario, or?
Sure. Um, First, I mean, personally, I when Tashi asked me to do this, I told Tashi, by the way, I hope you know that I'm not against marriage, and I do think that people have very different reasons for seeking, a marital union, and as I said in my presentation, I I it's not for me to judge whether those reasons are you know they're good reasons or they're bad or they're acceptable or unacceptable. It's not my place to judge whether something is heteronormative or not. Even these things tend to be very subjective. um, for me, the over time, the most important thing to look out for has tended to be insisting on an absence of violence, in any kind of relationship, and that being the very important way of for me what can be acceptable or not. So it really, I mean, for me, I'm sure Ponni would have given you a different answer, and maybe Sunil
Ponni's
thinks
back,
about.
by the way.
Okay, so I think it was Apurva, right? Apurva, maybe you can ask this to Ponni. She would have a different take.
Okay. Should I repeat the question, Aditya?
Yes, please.
Yes,
So
I got the phone out of the call.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask that there's a lot of policing happened over queer marriages and saying that it's basically moving towards heteronormative life or choosing to live that kind of a life. Whereas it shouldn't we also evolve the whole concept of marriage as it started, because we all have been evolving with our lives, with the concept of love, what has not been acceptable by the culture and everything. So yeah, that's what I wanted to ask the views of the panel on this.
Shall I try to answer this now? Or?
Yes, Ponni, please.
Okay. So I want to sort of talk about your use of the term policing, actually. And I think that's, for me, that's the key part of that sentence, actually. because I think there's a big difference between having debates, discussions, and feeling policed for your choices and decisions. And you're right. I think this is not the only context in which a sort of imagined notions of ideal politically correct lives or queer lives are imposed upon others, etc. But then I think and I can understand that can be extremely suffocating, especially when it comes from your own community. But at the same time, it's also happening in the context of the much more powerful policing that's being done by state and non-state actors with hegemonic power in society. So I think in all our anguish about the policing within our own communities, I think which are very fair, and I share that anguish that we may be losing spaces to speak across differences. We may be feeling fear to express our opinions because it may be attacked on the first go rather than engaged with. But having said all of that, I don't think we can lose sight of the bigger hegemonic structures that continue to suffocate all of us. About marriage particularly, I don't think it's a question of quote unquote evolving, as it were. I think the problem with the imagery or the use of the term evolution itself is that it assumes a certain singular path. And I think what we've tried to talk about in this panel today, and what many of us have been trying to talk about and live by, is that our realities have always been extremely diverse and complicated. Sunil took us on a very long journey. Mario and I and so many people who have joined us today, we've all been living lives with intimacies and love and trust that are extremely complicated. So I think what we've tried to say is that the power of existing ways of organizing intimate relationships socially and legally, and if we use marriage as the shortcut to describe that power, it's inadequate to represent what we really want. So, and having said that, like all of us have said, I think there are a range of reasons why people choose to engage with, live within structures that provide us with rights and safety. And we've all three of us have said that as well. I think it's just that as we continue to do that, we have to be acutely aware of its hegemonic power at all times. And we have to not let that curb our imagination for queer kinship, like Mario talked about, for the complex life that Sunil has laid out before us. And I was trying to say that that hegemonic power is very deep rooted. And so you don't compare the institution of marriage to the institution of slavery lightly. Of course, there's a legal basis for it, but if you don't speak the language of the law, which if you don't, I'm happy for you. It's a very huge thing to do, and it's done very consciously because that is the power of the institution as it exists. So I think what we're trying to do here is, can we have a conversation that's open to all of these realities, to its hegemony, to the reality of everyday lives, to the imaginations that we have the right to have of how we make our lives, all of that in one go. So I don't think evolution is a useful way to think about it, because it immediately puts us, monkey to human, etc. So yeah.
No, what I meant was we can't like box everything into heteronormative way of living is what the thought process was. I mean, we can look beyond it. Definitely from where I have grown up and how I have seen, obviously everything is very heteronormative, and where I see my future, I don't see it heteronormative, but I do see it as in terms of kingship and being with somebody and being legally married to it. So why should this be called as a heteronormative? Why can't it be called anything else? something like that. I mean, I don't know if I'm even putting my question right. Might be using terms also wrong, not in a right way, but yeah. But thanks a lot for your answer.
I'm back online, I think. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Yep,
Hi.
I can hear you. Hi.
Ponni, you want to address Vikram's question too?
Yeah, I heard only half of it, and then I got thrown out. I think there's a lot of nerdy legal conversations we can have about the history of contract law and slavery and so all of that. I wanted to make 2 points from what I heard and of that question. First is in terms of gender identity, and I think thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think in some ways it is a much more fundamental contract, which we all have to sign. I mean, actually, it's interesting because we don't sign them, right? So it has more in common with slavery. So it's decided for us. So we are the object upon which the contract of which gender we belong to is signed at birth, and then is constantly reaffirmed, etc. And that is an essential element to heteronormativity as well. So that's something to consider. But I also think that, having said that, I don't want to make simplistic connections like that. I think that connection requires a much more very quiet and reasoned thought and consideration that I can't do at this exact moment. But I just wanted to say that, and I've forgotten my second point. So, yeah.
Just as well, we're running short on time. Just sorry, I just want to acknowledge that 2 people have raised their hands, Ketki Chaukani and Nandini Anand.
Let's just get to Sunil if he has to answer with Vikram's
Okay,
question.
sorry.
Sunil?
Which I missed altogether. So can you just quickly sum it up?
I will. So, Vikram, are you there?
I was just asking if you wanted to think about the relation between the 2 documents that you mentioned, which is about the passport and the marriage certificate, and if you wanted to put them together in thought. That's all.
Yes, I guess mostly one never thinks about them. But the passport, let's start with the passport. The passport has meant that my relationship with somebody with another passport has made one of us completely dependent on the other, meaning for the 2 of us, for example, live in London now. With his passport, the only way he could even arrive here is through some kind of spousal arrangement. Otherwise, that would not have been possible. In my case, in the 80s, I could arrive because I was coming with a Western passport, but even then doesn't allow you to either work or do anything useful. So it makes you entirely dependent on the partner person. So passports have become significant, and there's and becoming even more so, I think, given the kind of right-wing ultra-nationalist climate that we are seeing everywhere, including India. So in India, I can't have a passport. I can only have what's called an OCI. And as you all probably know, when this COVID thing happened, the first thing they did was say OCIs are not welcome. So I can't even go to India right now. So that's what my passport means. And the marriage thing was, I've been really against it all my life, but in the end, it began to feel like a little bit of a radical act, because there was so much outcry and halla against this idea that how could 2 people who were not heterosexually opposite gendered even think about getting married. I mean, there was so much put up against it that it seemed like something worth fighting for. And it seemed so impossible. I'll actually live most of my life thinking it was completely impossible. You know, much as the way many of my peers who still live in India never thought it would get decriminalized in India. You know, we just never, you just don't think it's even possible given our cultural baggage. So, yes, so it's, I did a kind of U-turn. I think one of the things I've just learned with age is that it's possible to change your mind. So I find context and all of that keeps changing, you know. And once the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, there's no putting it back. I think once this idea took root, you know, there was a kind of unifying moment around changing the law, like 377 in India, that covered over a lot of differences. And I think in the West, where I was, the marriage thing became a similar issue that everybody wanted to fight for. Now, of course, I'm aware that it's still very problematic in the sense that it's a double-edged sword in a way. So for example, when the two of us went back from Toronto to Delhi, having gotten married, the people who were like super excited were my cousins. You know, my very heteronormative casteist banyas from UP said, "Shadi ho gayi, hum to aa rahe hain." So they immediately came round, and we had marigolds, and we had the whole Hindu ritual. And Charan was like welcomed into this banya family, although you know he doesn't really look like them. And I think they even gave him the envelope with the money and everything. So he's properly, you know, like taken into the family. So that's like, you don't know how to think about that. First, it's very touching. You know, these are people who are not very metropolitan, let's say. But something happened that allows them to include him as part of us. So that's, I feel, is kind of a kind of hurdle that you know, normally we wouldn't even bother with trying to explain to them. He would just be a friend. But this has made it possible for him to be formally acknowledged as my partner, which is kind of quite nice. And the good thing is when we go to family gatherings, as soon as you enter the house, they say all the women to the left and all the men to the right. So that's very good. So we all go off with the guys. I said, good, we can teach some of the guys some new tricks also. So, I mean, you know what I mean? But at the same time, our marriage is not having any critical effect on them. So that's also happening, meaning we have done something that made us acceptable, but they're not doing anything to change their ways. That had made no impact on their thinking in terms of their caste and their relations and their tribalism, you know, and all of that. All it means is they think, acha, now Charan Singh has suddenly miraculously crossed the barrier and become a Gupta somehow. So now we're the Gupta Singhs. Just think, Ponni, we could have been the Gupta Arasus. And they would have said, "Oh, Madrasi kahan se laya hai?" But if we got married, they wouldn't have said that. They've said, "Hi, achhi pyari beti aa gayi." Okay, sorry, I've been told not to carry on like this. I'll shut up right now.
Ketki, you want to go ahead and ask your question, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for the discussion. It was very interesting. I'm actually coming from a single perspective to this entire discussion, and one of the reasons I was excited for it, and some of the points which Ponni raised, which Mario raised, were fascinating, especially when we're discussing about the benefits that marriage gives us, you know, the legal benefits, the social benefits, the financial and medical benefits that marriage gives us. And while coming from a single perspective, as in, you know, basically, you know, I'm a single study scholar where we study people who are singles lives. So I'm thinking that, you know, there's a lot of commonality and a lot of overlap between the way single study scholars think about marriage and think about let's say, communities, which overlaps with what Mario is saying, or about what queer scholars are talking about, or what Ponni is saying about. And I've been thinking about this for a while. I'm not a legal scholar, so I've been wondering that, let's say, as a single woman, what happens to my money after I die? What happens to my medical insurance? So these are questions which have been raised by a number of queer scholars in the past. It's not something new. And I'm wondering, instead of saying that, oh, I want to also benefit that by getting married, I want to say, what are the ways in which, as Ponni raised, that what are the ways in which I can have these benefits without being part of a couple? I'm not even talking about marriage, not even being part of a social couple, right? So, and what I found, Ponni, is a question of that, legality wants consistency. It wants a consistency that you can't like just, one person for medical, one person for finance, one person for property. So how does this work? I've been thinking about this. I'm just thinking out loud if we could work through that, because that would be something what the moment Menaka Guruswamy and, the other person, I don't remember her name, spoke about marriage equality. My first thought was, what happens to people, again, single people get left out, because that's always been the problem, single people getting left out of these benefits, social, legal, and so on and so forth, right? So I've been wondering, what are the ways in which legally we can make these benefits available? It might be utopian, but I don't know. I mean, I think we need to think together with legal scholars, and this would include both queer, non-queer people who are outside the couple norm. That's exactly what Mario was talking about, right? Outside the couple norm. Right.
Ketki, I'm not a legal scholar myself. Thank you for that question. But I do know that people have been pondering over these issues for a long time, and I don't think there's a catch-all answer in terms of what one does. But I remember in the early 2000s going to Gay Bombay meetings in here in Bombay, and there were conversations about how you could use available legal mechanisms in order to let somebody else inherit your property, or uh, let somebody take care of you medically. I don't remember the details, but there were some folks at that time who had said that uh, one of the easiest ways to do this is to create a company in which both of you are partners, and therefore some rights then accrue to the other person as a result. In general, I would assume that most of the laws that govern this would be, because we are a country of personal laws, it would follow whatever personal law you come with. So that's my sense. But I'm not a legal scholar at all. Ponni is more of a legal scholar than I am.
That was Leslie's advice to me, Mario, when we were all came to visit you that time in Pune. She said, just do a limited company type thing, and you are just shareholders in it, and you can share the house, whatever. But I think I forgot to mention in my talk was when AIDS came, it really revealed in a big way how all of these partnerships people were living in were legally worthless. As soon as somebody died, the biological family came and just took over all the property and got rid of the other person. So I think that was a big shock and eye-opener for people here.
Absolutely.
And the other thing, there's civil, what here they call civil partnership. So it's not a marriage, but it's a paper thing where kind of two single people sign up for some joint arrangements. I don't know if it can extend to more than two at a time, but it's something that queer people got in the UK for a while before marriage. And then what's happened now is that the hetero people, the straight people have been demanding it because they didn't have it. So if they lived together, they didn't have any right. So they were quite irritated that we got it and they didn't have it. So now, finally, that's the latest on this front, is that heteros in the UK can also now live without being married and call themselves a civil partnership. So they write on your tails.
Nandini, you want to go next? Ponni, you want to answer?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So
Go ahead.
I think just to add to what everyone else has said, and to go back to the question about like just wanting to be fundamentally single as a social unit, right? And I think we have to very seriously consider this, because marriage or not marriage, I think we're all battling it within ourselves as well as in our social networks, the sort of hierarchy where coupledom or any one relationship is higher than the other. And of course, there are emotional realities to that. But how does that emotional reality manifest in social legal context? These are things we need to be really conscious and thoughtful of in our lives. But I think just to say, I have a lot of weird thoughts for the utopian future about this. But just in the world that we live in currently, I think my thing would be to not reveal the nature of your relationship to whoever you're making any legal arrangements with, whether it's a bank account, whether it's medical, whenever you're not asked, to not say so, right? So for example, I have a joint account in India with my now not anymore romantic partner, but very much part of my web of people who is not a citizen of India, but OCI, but I am. And we have a joint account in Perungudi branch in Madras, you know. And so then they were like, who are you two? We were like, friends, you know. And so we both have this financial transaction that we've just made and will continue to have most probably for the rest of our lives, with various things changing in the nature of our relationship, which remains unrevealed. So I think from the birth certificate onwards to everything, I think we need to look for those loopholes where you don't necessarily we shouldn't assume that we have to reveal the nature of our relationships to the law, to governance, to the state. So I have a life insurance thing, which is in the name of my past romantic partner who's no longer alive even, you know. And again, there I did not reveal what she was to me. I just put her name down. So I think to not say unless we are explicitly asked is something we can do immediately. And I think we should try and do that all the way up to wills if possible. But I will hold back on the utopian dreams because I don't want to take up too much time. Yeah. Can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Tashi.
Because I did not unmute myself. So now so we'll take Nandini's and Anjita's questions together, and then we'll conclude the session, I think.
Okay, I'll go. So it's primarily for Ponni, I guess. My question is, the current laws, marriage laws, for example. Okay, if you took at Indian law, it's already a mess. We have for different religion, different laws, which is a mess to begin with. But even on top of it, there's a lot of gender-based things. So I think Sunil was mentioning about civil partnership, right? So how practical or possible do you see we have a civil partnership that is neither referent of gender or religion? We'll move to it at some point. Does my question make sense?
Are you asking is it practically possible to move to a civil partnership model like in the UK, in India?
Unified civil partnership model. I still don't know whether UK civil partnership model has gender or other discriminations, or does it make exemptions for custom religious things and stuff. So I am trying to see is there even a framework anywhere in the world that is just a simple civil partnership between two individuals without any reference clauses for gender.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a whole range of different models all over the world. Other parts of the world, the regime of law called common law partnerships is governed by shared residence, for example, right? So it's me and I don't know, Tashi could be living with each other, and we would be a common law unit. And there are many friends who are not, and so the nature of mine and Tashi's relationship is assumed to be romantic or sexual, but actually it doesn't have to be. We just have to show bills that came in both our names. and we can file taxes together in Canada, right? So I so like that. I think there are multiple models all over, and I don't think we can. I think we need to. I think the key to this is that we need to think about this slowly, and I think the idea of what Mario brought about of what the next step of our legal battles are. The strength of it being non-discrimination is that apart from the fact that it's a much more inclusive in terms of caste, class, region, etc., of the people who fall within the ambit of queerness or non-normativity, the other good part about it is that it helps us to begin the process of questioning the defaultness of marriage as the only organizing social legal principle. And it's possible to include that within our articulation of non-discrimination as well. So rather than asking for admission into what's there, we can say don't discriminate against us because we don't want to be in it to begin with. And then that opens up the space for all the different ways in which the model of marriage governs our lives. I think that's the thing. It's not just restricted to just the laws around marriage, whether it's the civil uniform civil code so-called or the various personal laws. It's about so many, every aspect of life, right? So when you go to rent a house, you are asked if you're married or not. So, and there are other things that, I mean, sitting in Sri Lanka, I realize we have so many things that are quote unquote progressive because it's all relative. So here you can't even get a social security document if you're a single person. You have to be attached to a family in order to be able to get the social security document here. Okay. And if you're married, you can't study to be a teacher. Like there's all kinds of like stuff that is appalling here. So there are some of those things which are not there in India. So I think the first step would be to destabilize the marriage unit as the only way by which we imagine civil rights. And I think that open up the space for a lot of different kinds of thinking, which I'm going to be honest with you, there are many strands that I often think about and many of us have been talking about, but this is not the space to actually lay them out because they're not evolved enough yet. But at least I'm saying let's keep the space open to think broadly and not fit ourselves within this mold, I think, at this stage.
Okay. Anjita? Anjita, are you there? Hello, Anjita. Hello. Okay, looks like Anjita is not available.
Maybe she's muted. Is she muted?
No, she's not muted also. Anjita? Hello? No. Okay. So I think you're also almost, I mean, does anyone want to add anything else? We are past half an hour of time, I think, but anyone else want to add any last comments, points, statements?
Well, thank you for...
questions? Thank you, Ponni. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Sunil. Like doing this, I mean, yeah, sorry for bullying you all three into this. I mean, it's amazing. I think, I mean, personally speaking, I grew up being scared. I mean, before I knew my sexuality, gender or anything, I think the first thing I was scared about getting married, I think. I've seen married people, I've been grown up seeing married people all around. And like, God, I need to do that after I grow up. Why would people do that? So I mean, that was scary for me, I think. So thankfully, I'm glad that I've turned out to be queer or whatever that is, that I don't need to get married in that sense. But also, I think from where I come from, I'm too critical about thinking about marriage as the only companionship where all your civil rights or all your social legal rights are everything dependent on that particular single relationship with another person, I think. But from this conversation, what I think is that, of course, one need to also look at and think about, from what Sunil presented, where they come from, getting married is essential in that sense. there is one cannot deny the fact that it was a necessity of that time. And so who can afford to say that we do not want to get married, we want to look outside the unit of the marriage, and who cannot afford to do that, who need to give in and do it? I think it's a different. So that's something that need to be understood between different people, I think. And also, the as much as progressive liberal politics that we talk within the queer community, I think it's also essentially important. This is something that I need to remind myself, I think, that people who ask for marriage necessarily are not evil people, are not necessarily regressive, or people who need to be like, put out and say that, these are all, which I've done. I need to agree, I've done that. So I'm saying probably we need to figure out better ways of communicating and having conversations between queer people who look at marriage differently. And I think there are many people who look at marriage in many different ways, I think. But to be able to have that conversation, what is that we are all talking about, even to get to listen to each other and be able to communicate to each other is a task, I think. And I hope that happens eventually I hope that happens before we jump into conclusions of going to court, making a legal battle, and then, because few are able to do that, and few have the privilege and the luxury and everything to be able to go and do that before talking it in the community, because they assume that everyone wants one thing in the community, is also problematic, I think. And that need to be really questioned, because who is giving few people authority to represent an entire community and decide what we all want is also challenging, I think. So thank you for throwing light at the legal aspects, kinship, interestingly, liberation, and Sunil, thanks for taking through us that entire timeline of things, which otherwise many of us would have not seen those pictures or that context, I think. Thank you, three of you, for doing this. And thank you for letting me harass you three for last 1 week with everything. And thank you for everyone joining us and participating in the session. We look forward for the next Queer Up session, and hopefully less technical glitches then, and more discussion. Thank you all. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Tashi.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Shall I press the red button?
Are you desperate to do